Welcome everyone to today's episode. We're about to embark on a journey through the pages of the Old Testament, specifically focusing on a story that holds a profound lesson for us all. This is the tale of Uzza and the Ark of the Covenant, an account that blends the divine, the sacred, and the tragically human into a narrative that's as thought-provoking as it is sobering. Picture this: the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of God's presence among his people, being moved from one place to another. But instead of being carried as God had instructed, it was placed on a cart and pulled by oxen. Now you might be wondering, what's the big deal? Why does it matter how the ark was transported? Well, as we'll see, it mattered a great deal indeed. The man at the center of this story is Uzza. He was there when the oxen stumbled and the ark was about to fall. Without thinking, he reached out his hand to steady the ark. It seemed like a sensible thing to do, right? But this seemingly small act had huge consequences. Uzza was struck down on the spot. He died because he touched the Ark of the Covenant. But why? Why did Uzza, who only intended to prevent the ark from falling, die for his action? This is the question we'll be exploring today. Was Uzza's death merely a result of an impromptu decision born out of a desire to protect something sacred? Or was it a consequence of a deeper issue, a disregard for the specific instructions God had given about handling his holy Ark of the Covenant? To unravel this, we'll need to delve into the biblical text, scrutinize the details, and seek to understand what exactly it was that God had commanded about transporting the ark. So, let's get started. Join me as we explore why carrying the ark incorrectly led to Uzza's tragic death, and how it was supposed to be carried according to God's instructions. The story unfolds in 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 13, where King David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant, for those unfamiliar, is a sacred chest said to contain the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. It symbolized God's tangible presence among his people and was central to their worship. Now, King David, with all his good intentions, decided to transport this sacred artifact not in the way God had specifically instructed, but on a new cart pulled by oxen. Picture this: the ark, this immensely sacred object, bouncing along on a wooden cart drawn by beasts of burden. It's a sight that would have been as unconventional as it was alarming. You see, this was not how the ark was supposed to be moved. God had given clear instructions about this in the books of Exodus and Numbers. According to these divine directives, the ark was to be carried on the shoulders of the Levites, the priestly tribe, using poles inserted through rings on the sides of the ark. This method was designed to ensure that no one would touch the ark itself, for it was considered holy and sacred. But King David, in his eagerness to bring the ark to Jerusalem, overlooked these details. He chose convenience over obedience, human logic over divine command. His decision to use a cart, while seemingly practical, went against God's commandment. It was a decision that would have grave consequences, as we shall see in the following scenes. David's decision to transport the Ark of the Covenant on a cart pulled by oxen, despite his good intentions, was a direct violation of God's explicit instructions. It was a decision that would lead to a tragic incident, a stark reminder of the importance of obedience to God's commands, and the severe consequences of not treating his holy presence with the respect it deserves. But what were God's instructions, you might ask? Well, they were quite specific and clear. According to the books of Exodus 25 and Numbers 4, God commanded that the Ark of the Covenant, this sacred symbol of his divine presence, should not be touched directly. Instead, it was to be transported using poles. These weren't just any poles, mind you. They were to be made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. These poles were to be inserted through rings that were on the sides of the ark. This method ensured that the ark would be held aloft, carried shoulder high by the Levites, and no hand would touch the ark itself. Now, the Levites weren't just any random tribe of Israel. They were chosen by God himself to be his priests. They were responsible for the tabernacle, the mobile place of worship, and all its sacred apparatus, including the Ark of the Covenant. Their role was not only a privilege, but also a solemn responsibility. The instructions for carrying the ark were not given as suggestions or mere guidelines. They were divine commands, direct from God, and they were to be followed to the letter. No improvisations, no shortcuts, no modern methods. The ark was considered holy, sacred, set apart, and it commanded reverence. It was a physical representation of the divine presence of God among his people. It wasn't just a box overlaid with gold. It was a holy symbol of God's covenant with his people. Disobeying the instructions for its handling wasn't just a matter of improper procedure, it was a direct violation of God's command. A lack of reverence for what was holy and a demonstration of disobedience toward God himself. The Levites were chosen for this task specifically, and they were to follow these instructions carefully to prevent any mishandling or irreverence toward the ark. This was God's command and instruction. It was a mandate given with clarity, leaving no room for doubt or misunderstanding. And as we will see, not adhering to these instructions had severe consequences. As the ark was being transported on the cart, disaster struck. The oxen pulling the cart stumbled, causing the ark to shift precariously. This was the moment when Uzza, who was walking alongside the cart, instinctively reached out his hand to steady the ark. It was a natural response, an attempt to prevent the holy ark from falling to the ground. However, Uzza's action, though well-intended, was a direct violation of God's command. Let's take a moment to understand why this act was so significant. The Ark of the Covenant was not just any artifact. It represented the very presence of God among his people. It was holy and sacred, and God had given clear instructions that no one was to touch it. These instructions were not arbitrary. They were meant to instill reverence and respect for God's holiness and his commandments. Uzza's action, while seemingly small, was a profound mistake. It demonstrated a lack of understanding and reverence for God's holiness. By reaching out to touch the ark, Uzza took upon himself a task that was meant only for the Levites, a task that required strict adherence to God's instructions. Moreover, Uzza's action was not just about him. It was a reflection of the collective disregard for God's instructions on how the ark was to be handled. King David and the people of Israel had chosen to transport the ark on a cart, contrary to God's commandment. And now, Uzza had touched the ark, further violating God's command. Despite Uzza's good intentions, his actions demonstrated a lack of reverence for the holiness of the ark and disobedience to God's instructions. It was a grave mistake, one that would have severe consequences, not just for Uzza, but for all of Israel, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of obeying God's commandments and approaching his holy presence with utmost reverence and respect. Uzza's actions had severe consequences. When he reached out his hand to steady the Ark of the Covenant, he acted out of instinct, but he also acted in direct disobedience to God's command. The Ark was not to be touched by any but the Levites, and even they were to handle it with poles, not their bare hands. This was a clear commandment given by God, outlined in his instructions to Moses. Uzza's intentions might have been good, but good intentions do not excuse disobedience. In the moment when the oxen stumbled, Uzza chose to ignore God's command, choosing instead to trust in his own judgment. This act of disobedience was not taken lightly. In response to Uzza's actions, the Bible tells us that God's anger was kindled against him, and he was struck down on the spot for his irreverence. This was a direct and immediate consequence of his disobedience. Some might wonder why the punishment was so severe, but it's essential to remember that the Ark of the Covenant was not just a physical object. It represented God's presence among his people, and it was to be treated with the utmost respect and reverence. Uzza's death is shocking and tragic, but it serves a purpose. It serves as a stark reminder of the importance of obedience to God's commands, no matter how inconvenient or counterintuitive they might seem. It also emphasizes the need to approach God's presence with reverence and respect. We cannot treat God's holiness casually or take it lightly. In the end, the story of Uzza and the Ark of the Covenant is a lesson in obedience and reverence. It teaches us that God's commands are not suggestions, but requirements that carry real consequences when ignored. Uzza's death serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of obedience to God's commands and the need to approach his presence with reverence and respect. This tragic incident has important lessons for us. The story of Uzza and the Ark of the Covenant, as recorded in the Old Testament, is a stark reminder of the consequences of disregarding God's instructions. It underscores the importance of obedience and reverence when approaching matters of faith and holiness. Let's recap the main points of the story. King David sought to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. However, instead of adhering to God's specific instructions for its transport, he chose to carry it on a cart drawn by oxen. This was a direct violation of God's command as stated in the books of Exodus and Numbers, which specified that the ark was to be carried by the Levites using poles, thus ensuring that no one would touch the ark itself. Uzza, despite his good intentions, paid the ultimate price for this oversight. When the oxen stumbled and the ark threatened to fall, Uzza instinctively reached out to steady it. His touch, though well-meaning, was an act of irreverence towards the holiness of the ark. It was a breach of God's commandment, and for this, Uzza was struck down. The story of Uzza is not just a tale of ancient times, it resonates with us today. It serves as a reminder that obedience to God's commands is not optional or negotiable. It's not enough to have good intentions or to act out of convenience. God's instructions are there for a reason. They are to be followed as given, not adjusted or modified according to our preferences. Moreover, the story emphasizes the need for reverence in our approach to God and the things of God. The Ark of the Covenant was not just a golden box. It was a representation of God's presence among his people. Uzza's casual touch was a violation of its sanctity, but the story of Uzza also carries a note of hope. It reminds us that God's instructions are not arbitrary rules, but guidelines designed for our good. By following them, we show our respect for God's holiness and our commitment to walking in his ways. So as we reflect on this story, let's remember its lessons. Let's strive to obey God's commands, not out of fear, but out of love and reverence for him. Let's treat the things of God with the respect they deserve. And let's remember that in our journey of faith, obedience is not just about following rules, it's about honoring God. By following his instructions, we honor his holiness and avoid the consequences of disobedience. Thank you for joining me today as we explored the story of Uzza and the Ark of the Covenant. It's a powerful tale that serves as a stark reminder of the sanctity of God's commands and the consequences of disregarding them. The story of Uzza isn't just a historical report, but a lesson for all of us, teaching us the importance of obedience and reverence when approaching the things of God. In our journey today, we delved into the details of how King David, with good intentions, chose to transport the Ark of the Covenant in a way that didn't align with God's explicit instructions. Instead of having the Levites carry the ark using poles as God had commanded, David decided to transport it on a cart pulled by oxen, a decision that led to a tragic outcome. We saw how Uzza, in a bid to prevent a disaster, reached out to steady the ark when the oxen stumbled, directly violating God's command not to touch the ark. His actions, although well-intended, were seen as a lack of reverence for the holiness of the ark, leading to his untimely death. So, what can we learn from this sobering story? It teaches us that obedience to God's commands is not optional but essential. It emphasizes the importance of treating the things of God with the utmost respect and reverence. And it reminds us that even our good intentions cannot justify disobedience. In conclusion, let's remember to approach God's presence and his commands with reverence, respect, and obedience. Our journey through the story of Uzza and the Ark of the Covenant has underscored the importance of these values in our faith journey. Let's carry this lesson with us as we seek to honor God in our lives. Until next time, may God bless you abundantly.